Thanks for joining me, everybody. Chuck Morse, Left Right Radio, every afternoon at 12 noon. And my guest for this program is Allan J. Lichtman. He is an American political historian who teaches at American University in Washington, well known for predicting most of the presidential winners in the United States presidential election since 1984, including forecasting the 2016 election early. He's also the author of many interesting books, including The Case for Impeachment, which I want to talk about right now, but also FDR and the Jews, White Protestant Nation, The Rise of American Conservative Movement. Allan, thanks for joining me this afternoon.
My great pleasure.
Allan, I want to start out with a talk about your case for impeachment against President Donald J. Trump. Now, this has been floating around since day one. It's actually started probably the day he was elected. What in a nutshell, would you present as a case for impeaching President Trump?
You know, I predicted President Trump's election in a Washington Post interview in September of 2016. And he actually, when he got elected, wrote me a note on that Washington Post copy saying, "Congrats, Professor, good call," with his big, pen signature. But at that same time, before he got elected, I predicted he wouldn't survive 4 years and he would get impeached. And I thought that was kind of a throwaway line, but it went viral. I then wrote my book, The Case for Impeachment, which came out in April of 2017, and an updated paperback version in January 2018. Here is the paperback, which is now readily available. And in my updated version, I said he is vulnerable to impeachment on a number of different grounds. First of all, there is the Russia connection, possible potential conspiracy with the Russians to undermine our democracy. You know, Trump continually claims there's no collusion. That remains to be seen. The special counsel has not said there's no collusion. He's still looking into that. And then Trump has said, well, collusion is not a crime. 2 points about that. One, to impeach a president, you don't have to have an indictable crime. The House of Representatives, not the courts, have the sole power to impeach. And clearly, conspiring with the Russians to rig an election would be the kind of abuse of power that would be impeachable, not to mention violating laws against computer hacking, campaign finance laws, and conspiracy against the United States. One of the charges, I believe, against Paul Manafort. Second area is, of course, obstruction of justice. And it's not just the firing of James Comey, which he admitted was designed to obstruct the Russia investigation. He admitted it to Lester Holt in a TV interview. He even blurted it out in front of Russian diplomats, of all people. It's many other things as well, apparently asking Comey to shut down the Flynn investigation, dictating a phony explanation of the notorious June 2016 meeting between Russian operatives and the highest levels of the Trump campaign. Thirdly, there is the violation of the emoluments clause of the Constitution, which says you can't take anything of value from a foreign power or their entities without explicit permission of Congress. And he's engaged in all kinds of business deals that entangle him with foreign powers and their entities and that profit him. Next point I made was Trump's war on women. And of course, that is now coming home with the revelations of the payoffs to Stormy Daniels and Karen McDougal, which might involve various violations of law. They just executed a search and seizure against Michael Cohen, his personal fixer attorney, who was at least involved in the Stormy Daniels deal. And there are lawsuits now pending against him. And I have a chapter in my book called Lies, Lies, Lies. And if he is deposed under oath, either in a civil suit or before Robert Mueller, he is incapable of telling the truth. He's never told the truth throughout his career. So that, in a nutshell, are grounds for impeachment.
Okay. I mean, look, I have to say that I have never seen anything as coordinated and as massive as the war against President Trump. It's at all levels. It's not just the conventional enemies, and I don't want to use the word enemies in the sense that there's anything wrong with that, because it's Democrats and liberals. Of course, it's the opposition, the loyal opposition, but it's also liberal Republicans, it's internationalists, it's top business people, it's, the very powerful people have really more than opposed him, but they actually are trying to remove him from office. And I have never seen such a drumbeat. I mean, I remember the drumbeat against Reagan. I'm old enough to remember that. And even against George W. Bush in his last 2 years in office. But the level of the drumbeat against Trump is unprecedented. And, look, it bothers me mainly in a general sense because he was elected president of the United States. And I feel that if people want to oppose him, that's fine. They ought to wait till the next election and have someone run against him and defeat him, or get the midterms set up so that the Democrats take Congress and do that. That's how the system is supposed to work. And this idea of impeaching someone because you don't like their politics, you don't like who they are as a person. And to me, that circumvents, not only does it circumvent the will of the American people who voted for him and elected him, but it kind of runs contrary to our system. It gets into a question of almost turning this country into a parliamentary system where a president would have to stand up for a vote of confidence, as opposed to, the system we have, which a president serves a 4-year term and then runs for re-election and can serve another term.
Let me respond. Let me respond to all that. That's a lot.
Okay.
First of all, I can't speak for anyone else. I can only speak for myself. And I made it very clear in my book that I am not suggesting that we consider the impeachment of Donald Trump because we don't like his politics or we don't like his style. I'm very clear on that. I'm 71 years old. I remember presidents going all the way back to Dwight Eisenhower. Mm-hmm. And there are plenty of presidents with whom I have had major political differences. But I have never before talked about the possibility of impeaching a president. And as you saw from my outline, I'm not talking about impeaching him because of his style or his politics. I'm talking about impeaching him for serious abuses of power that threaten our democracy and threaten our society, like conspiring with the Russians to destroy our democracy. Let me finish.
No, you went over that already.
A lot of things in your statement. Next point.
Okay.
Impeachment is precisely how our system is supposed to work. The framers explicitly put impeachment into the Constitution as a peaceful, orderly, and legal means of dealing with a rogue president as an alternative to the way in which they dealt with runaway rulers in their own time by assassination or revolution. So when you say this isn't the way the system is supposed to work, you're wrong. This is precisely the way the system is supposed to work, to check a president who is so abusive to threaten our society. And what is required is not a rush to impeachment. I've never advocated that. But as in the past, a careful and considered impeachment investigation based upon what the special counsel ultimately comes up with. And Trump is so fearful of the special counsel that in every possible way he sought to obstruct and delegitimize his investigation, which, by the way, at every level is led by Republicans and Trump appointees. Robert Mueller is a lifetime Republican. Rod Rosenstein, his supervisor, is a Republican and a Trump appointee. Robert Ray, the head of the FBI, is a Republican and a Republican donor and a Trump appointee. Jeffrey Berman, the U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York, where they're supervising the Michael Cohen investigation, is a Republican, a donor to the Trump campaign, and a Trump appointee. So the notion that this is some kind of Democratic or anti-Trump conspiracy.
I didn't say it was.
Wrong.
Alan, look, first of all, of course, you're technically right. Impeachment is part of the Constitution. My point is that in American custom, American practice, we don't really bring that out unless there are really serious high crimes and misdemeanors. Now, look, I understand that your focus is not on his style and politics. What I would suggest, however, putting aside your focus, is that it is his politics and it is his style that has led to this kind of a fierce investigation. If it had been someone who was more in the establishment and who was a conventional president, we would have a lot of these things, which may or may not be true, overlooked. And we could go over the history of various presidents where you have a lot of this sort of stuff overlooked. Now, as far as collusion with Russia.
Respond to that. We've had nothing like this before. This is unprecedented. We have never before, even with Richard Nixon, had a president credibly accused of conspiring with a foreign power to destroy our democracy. And the response of the Trump administration has absolutely the Richard Nixon cover-up. Deny that there was any contact with the Russians. Then it turns out there are dozens upon dozens of contacts. Then claim, these contacts were all, inconsequential. They didn't matter. Just like Richard Nixon claimed the Watergate break-in was just a third-rate burglary. Of course, we need to investigate and look into this. Any president, credibly involved with so many contacts at the highest levels of his campaign with the Russians, a president who has invited the Russians to hack into private American emails, any president would be investigated. And that's all that's being done. An investigation led by Republicans.
Yeah, I don't think Obama would have been investigated for hacking, for putting bugs.
Of course it would have been. Look at Hillary Clinton. She was investigated 8 times over Benghazi, and she did absolutely nothing wrong. That's nonsense to say it wouldn't happen to a Democrat.
Alan, you're kind of filibustering here. Give me a chance, all right?
You've had plenty of chance.
Thank you very much. There is this issue of Obama's Justice Department looking, basically doing some eavesdropping and some unmasking. So that could have been investigated. My point here is that, first of all, as far as Russia collusion goes, there's already been a House committee that has said that they found no evidence of that. You probably reject that. And there's been
Who found no evidence of that? The Republicans led by Devin Nunes.
Thank you very much. I rest my case. Alan, I rest my case. You reject that. Alan, don't filibuster. Give me a chance to talk to you. You're interrupting.
Well, make some sense.
No, my sense is that, as I said, you would reject that because you find that to be tainted because it's so suddenly Republicans. My point is
they didn't even interview all the relevant witnesses.
No, look, I don't want to go into a long talk. I'm simply pointing out they made a very fine decision. The Senate has been investigating since day one. Mueller has been investigating. So far, there's been nothing really emerging that would indicate this conspiracy theory that somehow, and now look, Trump obviously had business relations with Russia. So did Hillary Clinton. I mean, a lot of people did. So did Joe Biden, apparently. But the point is that to make that into and to conflate that into a conspiracy that there was a political interaction, there has been no real proof of that, and that is a very serious charge. As far as the obstruction of justice goes,
let me respond to that. Before you get to something else,
I want to get to the obstruction of justice, Alan. Please, look, I don't like to do. I don't like to do.
We're done. We're done.
All right, go ahead. I don't want to do shout radio.
I'm not going to engage in this.
No. I don't want to do shout radio. I like to do, a calm type radio. Anyways. What I was going to say basically is that the charge of obstruction of justice is, you have to understand Donald Trump's style of communicating. He likes to talk, first of all, he has private conversations where he asks people to, do things, that kind of stuff. And it's probably the kind of communication that business people have. It's not really suitable necessarily to politics. And I think that he's had to learn and learned the hard way that you can't say some things in public life when you're elected that you might otherwise be able to say in private, like, gee, could you maybe ease up on the investigation of General Flynn and that kind of thing. I mean, it's not a matter of obstructing justice. I mean, I just think that whole charge is overblown, and it's unfair because it has to be put in the context of who President Trump is. And it runs on the basic premise that there is a conspiracy here to collude with Russia, which I don't think there is. And I don't think there's any evidence to suggest it. So, he is basically saying, given the fact that this is an attack and that this is, this whole concocted thing is trying to distract the presidency, I would like to see you rush up the investigation, try to conclude it, and that General Flynn, who really apparently there's now questions of whether he actually did lie to Vice President Pence even, that you can make the case that, you can get this thing done and investigate it and move on. I don't honestly think that that's obstruction of justice. If you want to put someone under a microscope and examine every word that they say, then I suppose you could find that to be the case. But the reality is that if you understand Donald Trump's style of communicating and how he does things, it's really not obstruction of justice. It's simply private conversations trying to move things along, the kind of private conversations that any political leader has. As far as the emolument clause, and I really didn't get much of a word in edgewise with Allan because he was making speeches, that is a bogus charge, I would suggest. That's like saying, they say, well, Trump is making a profit in his business from foreign leaders who are staying at his hotels and that kind of thing. And that he has hotels in those cities. He had international business long before he ran for office. In fact, he's one of the only people in history who is a businessman who is elected to the presidency. And the only time it would become a emolument is if he was charging more and making profits above and beyond what the market would bear, what his businesses would conventionally charge certain people because they were foreign people and because they wanted access to him as president. And that's not the case. They're paying the same rates that they would have paid whether he was president or not. They're not, that's what emolument means. Now, look, Barack Obama was the author of several books before he became president, and he received very large advances for those books. I think in one case he got $5 million. That's fine. But the point is that during his presidency, I'm sure that foreign leaders bought copies of his books and foreign citizens. Does that make him, in violation of the emoluments clause? I think not. I mean, I think that that's kind of a rather, thin charge against him. And it's quite wrong. War on women? No, I don't think so. He had a consensual relationship with a porn star, and he paid her money. According to Alan Dershowitz, there's nothing illegal about that, and I believe that. That's his business. It happened 10 years before he was in office. So there's no war on women. In fact, women have been promoted in his businesses and in his administration much more than I think most presidents, and he generally looks to talent. He doesn't look to whether or not a person's a woman or a man. I mean, he just doesn't have a record of that. That's that shows, I think in the case of Allan Lichtman, frankly, it shows a serious, kind of bias and political agenda. President Trump wants to make America great for all citizens. He's not against women. I mean, that's just preposterous. And I think that, let's be fair. I mean, anybody who looks at that on the face would have to admit that, I hope. Anyway, so I guess to wrap it up, Mr. Lichtman, he wanted to make a speech and he didn't want to be interrupted, so he made his speech. That's fine. I mean, I'm trying to do left-right radio here, but it's sometimes when you have someone on the left, they just they don't have much tolerance, and maybe that's a reflection of what's going on in politics now. I don't know. I mean, it hasn't been easy to get liberals. I had another guy on scheduled who bowed out liberals don't want to be questioned. I mean, maybe I think in the broad sense, frankly, it's a reflection of their authoritarian orientation. You know, the nanny state, state worship, control, whatever you want to call it. And that, that manifests itself as much in the person as it does in the politics. Maybe it goes to, all politics is personal, I suppose. I'm getting some interesting texts about this. You're certainly welcome to text the show. This one says, good grief, how unprofessional and hysterical. If he can't handle the interview with a polite professional like you, he should avoid interviews altogether. I feel sorry for his captive audience in the classroom. He is unaccustomed to being challenged. My son is a history professor and always cuts it right down the middle. Who other than a hardcore leftist would buy Allan's book? I mean, I tend to think that, he's probably one of these types, he's kind of a hothouse flower, who exists in the classroom where, people are afraid to challenge him because they're afraid of their futures and their grades. He's one of these left-wing professors, I'm guessing. I don't know that, but, they don't get out in the world and actually discuss and debate issues with people who may not goose step and to their particular point of view. And they can't, when they do encourage that, they go into shock, I guess. They can't tolerate it. I mean, they had a complete meltdown. Let's see, another comment here. There is no instruction of justice here, obstruction of justice. There has been a grand fishing expedition by Mueller who has yielded nothing but mermaid turds. I agree with that. There's no obstruction of justice. This thing is getting so ugly that we're accepting unconstitutional activities every day. I mean, Alan Dershowitz pointed out that the seizure of Donald Trump's personal lawyers' files, and by the way, Mueller went in there and seized everything, not just the Trump files, but all of his files, out of his office in New York, out of his personal home, took his computers, took his files. That's something that gets into the question of lawyer-client privilege. I mean, these are, this is information that is supposed to be confidential. It's between a lawyer and his client. This is like Gestapo kind of stuff. I mean, they go after someone and they're going to frighten him and they're going to scare the hell out of Trump. And they're going to say basically that a lawyer's personal business or professional business, frankly, with a client is now up for grabs, that a police arm of the government could come in and seize that information, and everyone's going to look the other way because of this demented and over-twisted hatred of President Donald Trump. Somehow that makes it okay. Whatever happened to civil liberties? Yes, let's just undo free elections and the will of the people. Yes, exactly. That's another comment here. That's the point. I mean, do we really think that that's the way to go? If you don't like Trump, run someone against him next time, make your case, bring up your issues. Don't try to undo him. Now, I was expecting Allan Lichtman to bring up to me, well, what about Bill Clinton? He was impeached. And, I think that the problem, I'm going to comment briefly on that. The problem for Bill Clinton was that he was so arrogant and so stupid that he actually openly and publicly violated a law in office. I mean, it wasn't a question of obstruction of justice conspiracy theories. Bill Clinton lied under oath in front of a federal judge about a personal matter, his sexual relationships. Now, that's a crime. That's called perjury. You go to jail for that, right? I mean, he actually did this in public. There was videoed him doing it in front of a federal judge after he'd been sworn in. That's why he was impeached. That's the only reason why he was impeached. It had nothing to do with his sex life. If Clinton had half a sense of humility and frankly, the stupidity of it, the whole thing was appalling. What he should have done when this whole issue came up was he should have settled it out of court. Maybe he should have done like Donald Trump did 10 years ago. make a settlement, hush money. I mean, there's nothing illegal about that. Or he should have stood up and said, look, I did this. I'm embarrassed. I apologize. It's not a good piece of news, but it happened, and it's between me and my wife, and I have nothing more to say about it. And then made some kind of settlement with Lewinsky or whoever the woman was involved. I think it was Paula Jones. And, it would have been a bad mark on him, and it would have been a bad story, and he would have been attacked maybe for a week or two, but then we would have gotten over it, and you would have moved on instead of his lying about it in front of a federal judge. So that's why he was impeached. He asked for that. Donald Trump, it's a whole different subject. Now, Allan Lichtman didn't want to talk about the investigation by a House committee on Obama's, whether or not the Obama administration, I don't know about Obama himself, but his administration was obtaining, surveillance on Trump campaign people by using that phony dossier. He didn't want to talk about that. But if that is the case, and if that's investigated, then that's an impeachable offense. Obama's out of office now. And by the way, I don't think that there should be an impeachment. Impeachment is the absolute last resort. I mean, Lichtman is technically right, like a lot of historians would be. It's in the Constitution. That's not the issue. I mean, there's also execution for treasons in the Constitution, too. Doesn't mean we do it. These things are there, but American custom has mitigated against impeachment in the interest of preserving the system. Look, as far as Obama goes, I never liked the issue, quite frankly, of his birth certificate, even though if it had been proven that he was not born in the United States, he could have been forced out of office. And I didn't think that was right. It was the American people obviously didn't care about it. It was aired before the election. Nobody cared. They elected him and he was elected. And I wanted to see him serve his terms in office because he was elected. I was against bringing that up, even though it was really Hillary Clinton who had brought it up in the first place back in 2008. And it was Obama himself who brought it up in his press materials for the release of his own book, where he referred to himself as a native of Kenya. Putting that aside, the fact is the American people had enough information about it. They didn't care. He was elected, and he should have served. Same thing with Donald Trump. Same thing with any American president. That's how our system effectively works. Maybe not technically, because we could look at the Constitution, but we have been leaning on the side of acceptance in this regard because we want to have a coherent and consistent government that is elected every 4 years and that reflects the will of the American people who elect those governments. Anyways, I want to thank you for joining me this afternoon. I want to thank Allan Lichtman. I'm sorry he got so hot up under the collar, but that's, I guess, the way it goes. I mean, I hope that isn't. I hope that isn't what happens going forward. As I hope to be interviewing more liberals. After all, this is left-right radio. I'm on the right, and I hope that my guest is on the left, so we can have a reasonable exchange of ideas. That didn't happen today because Mr. Lichtman, maybe he's used to being in a classroom where he gives speeches. But that's my goal. My intention is not to drown out anyone, but I mean, if I hadn't spoken up, he would have just taken over the whole show. The guy was flipping out. Anyway, again, thank you for watching, everybody.